With my goals in mind, I set out to prune my watercolor palette down to 18 colors or less. I wanted to use only earth-friendly pigments with good light-fast ratings. So in this video, I'll share with you my process for starting this journey, my reasoning behind some of my choices, and the final results. I didn't just want to end up with a healthy palette, but also one that excites me, containing paint that's long-lasting and a joy to work with. So first things first, we have to see what we're working with. If you're like me, you don't have a ton of extra money to buy new paint, and I never want to be wasteful, so I started out by laying out all of my tubes to see what I have, and I have plenty, 56 colors. So I separated my tubes by brand, then wrote down all the color names within that brand. Then I wrote down the pigments in each color, their light-fast rating, which is just how fast the color fades over time, and the transparency or opacity levels. Every color contains one or more pigment numbers. Those pigment numbers correlate to what the color is made of. So if you look on the tube, you can usually spot these numbers. If not, check out the manufacturer's website. They all start with P followed by another letter and number. PY is yellow, PR is red, PB is blue, etc. You get the idea. Then I used some online resources such as handprint.com and the Color of Art Pigment database. And I also referenced YouTubers Dr. Otto Kano and In Liquid Color, who do really great brand and color comparison videos. You should definitely go check them out. This was the most tedious part because sometimes I'd look up a pigment number and find that it wasn't necessarily clear whether it contained heavy metal, and I sometimes had to dig deeper and look on Wikipedia or elsewhere online to find out what pigment was in there and how it was mined and manufactured. One happy discovery is that many brands are starting to use synthetic pigments, which are much more environmentally friendly and cost-effective, and it just gives us more options. First, I eliminate all pigments that contain cadmium, cobalt, nickel, and aluminum. This part almost had me in tears because I was removing paint that I had been using almost every day for years. A few of my longtime favorites were cut from the roster, and I caught myself trying to justify keeping them on. But no, I need to be strong, and don't worry, I'm storing all of my other paint for use in future workshops. Next, eliminate fugitive colors, so that means anything with a poor light-fast rating. This is where I heavily used handprint.com because of their extremely thorough light-fast testing. Seriously, so much great knowledge being shared there. Then I removed almost all opaque colors because, as I mentioned, glazing is an important part of my process. Opaque colors can sometimes turn otherwise beautiful mixes into dull or muddy puddles, and that's just something I want to avoid. Lastly, I removed any colors with more than one pigment. The reason I prefer single pigment colors is because the more pigments you mix together, the higher your chances are that the resulting color will become muddy or unpredictable, and I just prefer clean mixes. So what if you can't decide between two colors? And that actually happened to me a lot. Well, if all the criteria was equally satisfactory to me, I went with my gut. I did some tests, I paid attention to how the paint flowed and moved, how it mixed with other colors, and whether it excited me and brought me joy when I was using it. As I mentioned, I wanted a palette of colors that make me want to pick up my brush, that get me excited to paint. And there's no harm in having two similar colors on your palette for a while so that you can thoroughly test them out. Eventually, I think you'll lean one way or the other and the choice will be made for you. So after all of that, a seemingly impossible task was done, but in a way it was just beginning. I had this new collection of beautiful colors that needed to be swatched and mixed and really put to the test, because after all, these colors need to play nicely. I also want to point out that I had a very difficult time deciding whether I wanted pre-mixed greens in my palette. I always felt that most tubes of green are pretty unnatural, and since I do a lot of mixing anyway, I usually end up making my own greens. However, I do recall many plein air painting sessions when I only had a few minutes to paint before the light changed, and that is when those pre-mixed greens are a lifesaver. I ended up choosing from the Daniel Smith Primatech line, which are single pigment colors utilizing natural minerals such as amethyst and jadeite to create really unique colors. They often are unpredictable and duotone and granulating, and the more I use them, the more they excite me. One thing I realized is that I've been less satisfied with my square swatch charts, as it doesn't really reflect my real workflow. So during my paintings, I tend to mix my colors on the paper instead of my palette. I thought my swatches should mimic that to give me the most accurate representation of results. This was my previous color mixing chart, and as you can see, it is massive, and the squares are actually tiny. I think I ran out of room, so I don't even think all the colors are on here. So this is an example of what I've been doing more recently to give me a better, more accurate representation of my colors and the mixes. So here you see I do these swatches using a mix of color in the center. Then on either end, I add the two pure colors. I allow them to bleed and flow and dry in a natural way, and this gives me a unique view of what these mixes would do in my painting. It's so much more useful for me for future reference. During this process, I kept going back and forth between certain colors and adding them or removing them, but finally I think I got to this point where I realized I had some gaps in my options and I needed to order two colors. Those two colors were anthraquinone blue, which is like a gorgeous indigo type blue, and quinacridone magenta, which is a super vibrant pinkish color, and it is light fast, which is really surprising. So in the end, I went from 56 colors down to 16. And now the fun could really begin. I started off by doing my typical swatch chart in my palette, and this actually will sit underneath a removable tray in my palette, and I often use this only for like the first couple weeks of having new colors, just to remind me what they look like when they dry, because as you know, there's quite a drying shift with a lot of colors. You might notice there's no purple on my palette. While in the past I would have never left home without my dioxazine purple, over time my aesthetic evolved and I shifted away from using a vibrant purple as much, and I now prefer custom purples, so I've decided to make my own. I realized doing these color mixing charts that my ultramarine finest and pyroline violet give me the most gorgeous natural purple, and I decided to make that version in my palette. Since my favorite version of purple is constantly changing, I'm only going to mix a little bit in my palette for now, and then I may change it whenever I run out. But it's just a basic purple, like an amethyst color to start with, and then when I'm outside painting, I can quickly add a warmer or a cooler color to match it to whatever I need. So now I'll walk you through my final selection of colors. I'll let you know how each one is special, how it's more earth-friendly than the previous pigments I used, as well as my favorite ways to use them in landscapes. You might think having 4 different blues on a palette is overkill, but honestly, if there's any color I want multiple versions of, it's blue. Each of these plays a unique role in a landscape, and I can use them in different areas. The first blue on the palette is my new M-gram anthraquinone blue, and this actually replaced my previous indigo blue, which contained 3 different pigments, and that includes anthraquinone. I find that this anthraquinone blue gives me such clean mixes, and oh my gosh, I am just head over heels for this color. I cannot wait to play with it more. Next we have Schmincke's Ultramarine Finest, and this is actually my new blue staple. It replaced my longtime favorite cobalt blue, which I used to use for everything. Ultramarine is such a pleasing color to look at on its own, but it also just mixes beautifully with so many other colors. It's my go-to color for skies, clouds, bodies of water, shadowy grasses, and so much more. Next we have Schmincke's Phthalo Sapphire Blue, which to me feels a bit punchier, and because it's a phthalo, it's capable of giving a more electric blue, although you will see soon that it's not the most electric on my palette. If I was going to remove any of the blues on the palette, it would be this, but since I had that extra spot, I decided to use it because I just really love this color. Finally, we have Schmincke Helio Turquoise. This is an electric blue that, when diluted properly and mixed with a little bit of the ultramarine, it actually makes the perfect bright blue sky color. And this color replaced my need for cerulean blue, which used to be my go-to sky color. So I'm really happy with this one. After deciding to include pre-mixed green on my palette, I went a bit overboard at first, but I finally narrowed it down to 4 very unique colors. Schmincke Phthalo Green is a gorgeous, vibrant, cool green that, when mixed with blue, gives me the most gorgeous, luscious turquoise blue. So for me, that means there's no need for a toxic cobalt turquoise that I used to use. Of course, because it's so vibrant, it requires very careful control because it can quickly overwhelm any mix. I quickly want to point out that I am not a chemist or a scientist. I get very confused when doing my research because there are so many terms that I'm unfamiliar with. And the phthalos are one of the areas that I still feel like I need to do a lot of research on because, I mean, when you look at the pigments and you look at all the information out there, maybe it's easy for a chemist, but for me, I found it very difficult to differentiate the synthetics versus the phthalos that use contain copper or traces of copper. For instance, there's like a ton of different ways that they write down what's in it. So like the different PB15s or the phthalos, they can be called metal-free alpha copper phthalo or epsilon copper phthalo or chlorinated copper. Like there's so many different versions, and I just recommend that you guys do your own research on those ones and make your own decisions. Let's get back to the video. Next up is my Schmincke Perylene Green, and I absolutely love this color. It is so versatile, and it's actually so dark that they list it as a black pigment color, but you can obviously see that it tints to green. And I find it to be incredibly useful for shadowy foliage or pine type trees, or anything that I just don't need like a sap green for. It's a little bit more neutral, so it works great for a more muted palette, and I just love that color so much. The first of the Primatech colors is Diopside Green, which is a gorgeous, almost grass green, a little bit cooler and deeper, and it works amazing with all the other greens as well as other colors. It's more granulating because it's one of the Daniel Smith Primatech colors, so it's got a lot of interest, visual texture when it dries. So I've actually been using this more and more, and it just makes the perfect medium grassy green for my palette. Finally, we have Serpentine Genuine, which is a very bright kind of sap green, but it's a little more interesting because it has kind of a duotone effect when it dries. So the lighter areas will be more of a yellowish, brownish color, and the deeper areas will be more green. And it's got a lot of granulation, so it has that beautiful visual texture. This color replaced one of my old favorites, which was Daniel Smith Green Gold. Unfortunately, Green Gold has nickel azo yellow in it, and that's one of the toxic colors I've removed from my palette. So this is the next best thing I could find, and because it has such an interesting texture, I actually find myself enjoying it even more. So I'm really happy I found this alternative. Next up, we have the reds. And as you can see, I don't have any cadmium reds or anything close to that bright fire truck red. That is a personal aesthetic choice. I've never liked those reds, and they don't really have a place in my landscapes. So these are more of the direction that I lean when I choose reds. One of the new stars of the show, Holbein Quinacridone Magenta, is much more versatile than I initially imagined. While I don't often use vibrant pinks or reds, especially on their own, I find having this color for the occasional flower or man-made element for urban sketching to be really useful. And because it's transparent and it's a single pigment color, I find it a joy to work with. Ah, my new mistress, Schminke Perylene Violet. This highly staining color has made an appearance in pretty much every painting I've made since adding it to my palette. Like a fine red wine, it pairs nicely with so many colors, giving me a truly unique, earthy mixture that works so well in my landscapes. In fact, it's so wonderful that it's my go-to primary red. Yep, no cadmium, no fire truck red for me. I much prefer this deeper burgundy color as my red, and it suits my aesthetic perfectly. Schminke Potter's Pink is another one of my most used colors, but rarely on its own. It's more of a mixing color for me, so I like to add this granulating pigment to a lot of my other mixes whenever I need a bit more texture. And I find that it works especially well for sandy beaches and rocks and tree bark and stuff like that. Schminke English Venetian Red almost didn't make the final cut, but the more I use it, the more I find this opaque color to be really useful. Again, this is more of a mixing color for me, especially as a base color for browns or a more earthy red option. And in fact, this pigment is found in my previous Van Dyke brown, which was always one of my convenience choices for browns. So I really enjoy using this English Venetian Red for some of my earthy mixtures. Let's jump straight into the oranges and yellows now. I have to admit I've always had a love-hate relationship with yellow, and they're constantly changing, so these are probably not going to be permanent members of my palette, but I'll let you know. Daniel Smith Quinacridone Burnt Orange has been a longtime favorite of mine, and even though I don't use a lot of orange in my work, it comes in really handy for certain scenes where I need a pop of color, like for instance a Scottish Highland landscape in the autumn when the ground cover turns into that beautiful rusty orange color. My go-to yellow right now is Schminke Yellow Ochre. It's a gorgeous, natural-looking yellow, and it ranges from more of a warm orange to a yellow, and this replaced my Nickel Azo Yellow. Nickel Azo Yellow used to be one of my favorites, however, I find now that the Yellow Ochre is even more versatile because it can be opaque when used thickly. If I need to warm it up at all, I just use the next color, which is my M-Gram Hansa Yellow. And this is the only pure yellow on my palette. This one replaced my old cadmium yellow. While I rarely use yellow on its own, it's always nice to have it as an option for mixing when you need a bit more warmth. Honestly, this color is probably going to be replaced when the tube is empty with a Daniel Smith Hansa Yellow Medium, which my research showed me is a bit more light fast and offers cleaner mixes. Finally, we have Sennelier Neutral Tint, a convenience color that I always preferred over black or the classic Payne's Gray. This has been on my palette since I first started with watercolor, and despite containing 3 different pigments, including anthraquinone blue, it's the perfect color to instantly neutralize any of my mixes. And when I'm painting outside and I'm losing the light, having a convenience color like this comes in handy. And it also is a great color for dramatic skies and really interesting washes. It takes me about 6 months of daily use to really get to know my colors so that they become a natural part of my language. So I plan on doing lots of experimenting and doing lots of different types of landscape scenes. And I want to share that journey with you guys. So if you are interested in that, stay tuned for the next few months of videos. I have a lot of cool stuff planned, and I really just cannot wait to get to know my palette even better. I've written up a big old blog post about all of my research and the discoveries that I'm finding along the way with using this palette, and that's available over on my website. I'll drop a link below. If you want to go even deeper, I'm going to give my patrons the high-res scans of my swatches as well as the actual spreadsheet with all of the pigment research and light fast ratings and toxicity that I have discovered along the way. So go check that out, and thank you so much to my patrons who are supporting me. Throughout my life, I've realized that every single choice we make accumulates and creates a ripple effect in our society and even across humanity. Change is not always easy, but I'm happy to report that this one small change actually was easy and incredibly rewarding. There's always more we can do to support the causes we love or to lessen our impact on the environment and make positive changes in the world. Sometimes looking at the big picture can overwhelm us, and we start to wonder what difference a single choice can make in the end. But no change has ever happened without that first step. I'm still learning, and I don't ever expect that I'll be an expert on this subject, but I am happy that I've taken this first step to make this change. I'm so excited to start exploring this palette, and I can't wait to share my future paintings with you guys. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and I wish you happy days ahead.